boys.
Hey, welcome to the channel. Warzone is in a special place that it has rarely been in, especially lately. We do not have a de facto meta. Many things are viable, and the weapons people are using diverse. It should be mentioned that the most meta weapon of all time, the DMR, was technically nerfed a couple times, but somehow they reverted it back to a previous nerf that actually made it stronger. I don't know all the details. I don't use it. I'm not a meta slave. But I just know people aren't using it as much as they had used to. That is just people would prefer using full auto weapons, and if it's not as strong as it once was, the community has just decided to move on. And I think that's great. So if you can remember back to October, before the Cold War integration, the meta was, for assault rifles at least, the Kilo 141 and the CR56 AMAX, which I have gameplay of the latter playing in the background for you. You probably know that they reduced the damage of Kilo at longer ranges now for Warzone, but it still has very little recoil and just takes a few more bullets at range to kill an enemy. It can still fry at mid-range and close, but the AMAX has been untouched and in my honest opinion is the best modern warfare assault rifle if you can control the recoil, which is manageable. Then the integration happened. All of the meta slaves were then using the DMR, which was probably the most gun ever introduced into the game. But excluding the DMR, there were some new assault rifles that could contend, if not outperform, the AMAX and the Kilo. Early on, people thought the Krig 6 would be the next Kilo and the next meta with its negligible recoil. The Groza, which has a similar damage profile to the AMAX, but a bit better at nearly every range. And of course, the FFAR, the FFAR, the FAR, which is absolutely nasty and is super imbalanced in my opinion. But of all the Cold War assault rifles, they all fall short in a few categories, especially if it's going to be ran as your long-range option or to be considered meta. Three things we need to look at: recoil, bullet velocity, and TTK. Through some exhaustive testing by JGod and True Game Data, we know that many attachments are bugged and don't work like they're supposed to, as well as what additional effects that they may have not explicitly shown that they have. So this could change as we learn more. But right now, it looks like no Cold War assault rifle will be meta because of these three inherent problems. Either they have a problem with one or all three of these problems. Let's address recoil first. The only barrel that the Cold War assault rifles have that reduce recoil is a 15% horizontal recoil from the Task Force barrel, I believe. So Cold War assault rifles can only reduce vertical recoil via the grip. Modern Warfare's assault rifle's longest barrel, on the other hand, almost always has a vertical recoil reduction of about 35%. And when you're trying to beam at long range, you need both horizontal and vertical recoil reduction, in my opinion, so that you can consistently hit your shots. Additionally, the VOK 3.0 scope that Modern Warfare weapons have reduces visual recoil, which is important because any recoil the weapon has only gets worse if you're zoomed in. For instance, the Groza with the axial scope attached has very little recoil after 20 shots, but the axial zooms in farther than the VOK and has no extra recoil reduction at all. So even a little recoil is tough at long ranges. The 20% bruiser grip vertical recoil is not enough to fix this. Modern Warfare assault rifles are bumping up against 45 to 60% total vertical recoil between the scope, the long barrel, and a foregrip, and roughly around 40% horizontal recoil between all the same attachments. So it will be difficult for Cold War assault rifles to beam at long range consistency because of that lack of control. So next up we have bullet velocity. This category is pretty important. If you want a shot at killing enemies at long range or when they're moving fast laterally, like if they're in a vehicle or dropping in, it's going to be tough with a low bullet velocity. And thanks to the previously mentioned content creators who do all the necessary testing, the max bullet velocity you're going to get with a Cold War assault rifle is about 1,000 or 1,100 meters per second. The Cold War version of the monolithic suppressor, I think it's called the agency suppressor, gives you more bullet velocity than the monolithic suppressor. The initial values of these Cold War weapons are so low that they can't get as high as the modern warfare assault rifles. So the Ram 7, AMAX, Kilo, M4 are all above the value of the 1,000 to 1,100 meters per second. They're sitting roughly around 1,250 meters per second. If you're not running a sniper, which the meta will never require, you need your assault rifle to be your long-range option. And the meta is going to be a gun that's consistent and dependable, which means you need a higher bullet velocity, which I don't think that the Cold War weapons can give you. So the third thing is damage values. I don't want to get lost by diving too far down this rabbit hole. That will take hours to fully understand. So we'll only look at a few values of a few guns. But all we need to understand here is TTK, time to kill. TTK is just a combination of a gun's assigned damage values when hitting a specific body part and its fire rate, and how long that takes. It's a look at how long it takes to deliver enough bullets to do enough damage, which is at least 250 damage. That's how much health points between the shields and health an enemy has. And to do that, we'll be looking at a few convenient graphs TrueGameData.com can produce. The FFR TTK is insane at all ranges, but will struggle to hit shots consistently at range as you don't run with a scope with it because the recoil is just too jumpy. Close behind that, though, is the AMAX, which has a much slower fire rate but is a heavy hitter. The next fastest is another fast-shooting AR, the Ram 7. And there's actually a bonus fourth point that's not explicitly stated. You can't really graph it, but it transcends all the other ones. At the end of the day, you're the one using this weapon, and it needs to be comfortable in your hands. Some people don't like the Ram because its recoil pattern is atypical. There's three guns who, when the longer you shoot, it goes up and to the left. And some people find that really weird. Typically it goes up to the right, and that their muscle memory that they've ingrained in themselves accounts for that normally. I kind of have the opposite, where I kind of like it going to the left, and I naturally correct for that. So the feel of the weapon is really important. So, which weapons, at least for me, from my perspective, score the highest in these four categories? I think the three that do that, in order from lowest TK to highest TK, the FFR, the AMAX, and the Ram 7. The M13 is not a contender because it just doesn't do enough damage at any of the ranges unless you're hitting headshots, which you just can't consistently count on doing. The M4 has too much recoil at long range to be a beamer. Trust me, I love the M4. I wish it was the best, but it's just not. The Kilo feels like you're shooting marshmallows at people at long range now. Plus, I just don't like it. Maybe I'm just biased, but it's just not what it was. And like I said before, I don't feel like that the Cold War assault rifles have the bullet velocity to be part of this conversation. Except for the FFR AR. It's just the fastest at pretty much everything. It is imbalanced and needs a nerf. I do not like using those Cold War weapons in their current state. They don't feel right. They don't feel good. They don't feel as polished as the modern warfare counterparts do. And I just don't want to get used to a weapon that I know will get nerfed. I'm not a meta slave. I tend to shy away from broken things. I never use the DMR. I use the Type 63 a little bit, but to each their own. I'm sure you'll see the FFAR being ran in tournaments, and it very well could be top tier, but I just don't see you beaming someone at 80 to 100 meters with that gun unless you're top tier in this game. So that's why I wouldn't consider the FFAR the meta. The AMAX is very, very good. As you can see from a lot of this gameplay, that it can hit like a truck. It can outgun most SMGs up close as well, and has very little damage fall off at range, which I can control most times. But the bullet velocity is only 959 meters per second, making it hard to beam at range. The good thing it has that keeps it competitive is it hits hard. So when you do hit, one every 4 shots, that shot is doing a lot of damage. And so through a process of elimination, that leaves us with, and what will be my go-to AR, and what I believe will be the meta, is the Ram 7. The Ram 7 has always, since the beginning of this game, flirted with greatness. There have been some big-name players advocating for the Ram, like Iceman Isaac and Symphony, who have already made videos themselves highlighting how good the Ram is right now. The problem is, there has always been an overpowered gun overshadowing the RAM. There was the M4, and that got nerfed. And there was the Growl, that got nerfed several times. And there was the Bruin, that got nerfed several times. And then the AMAX and the Kilo were strong. Kilo got nerfed. AMAX is still strong. But I think there's a few special things about the RAM now in this meta that allow it to be a more versatile and powerful weapon. There's two special characteristics that are the cherries on top of this ice cream sundae of a weapon, I think, that help give it an edge over the AMAX. So running through the previous metrics, specifically in regards to the RAM 7, we can see that the RAM just has absolutely legendary recoil. I find the RAM more controllable with the operator foregrip than the commando. And I know it moves up to the left a lot, I mentioned earlier, but I somehow naturally don't mind that. I don't really notice it, especially when you get fully kitted. But what is truly legendary about the RAM is its reduction in recoil when mounted. You already know that most guns barely have recoil when mounted, but the RAM virtually has no recoil when mounted. JGod did an excellent video a few months ago testing out every Modern Warfare gun and how much it benefits from being mounted. Most of the ARs and LMGs only saw a reduction in recoil of 40 to 50%. Like, mounting is really good with most guns, but 70%, the highest out of any gun in the game, making the RAM have almost negligible recoil when mounted. And it's pretty good when not mounted either. So here's a chart of the TTK of all the assault rifles that kill slower than the RAM 7, so I can just show you visually why I'm not using them. So this light blue is the M4. Basically, it does less damage from 0 to 42 meters, and then for about the next 2.5 meters, it has a faster TTK, and then it drops off like the RAM does, but then the RAM just continues straight. And you can see there's a big disparity between the M4, M13, and then the Kilo. And so what the RAM is kind of doing what the Kilo did to begin with. What had happened with the Kilo was this damage fall off never happened. It stayed here and just kept going. But the gun had so little recoil, you're hitting so many shots that it was really strong and really easy to use and very consistent. And that's why it was one of the meta guns, overshadowing the RAM. And so the RAM is kind of like the new Kilo, where it doesn't have this drop off like the Kilo does, and neither does the M4 and the M13, but the RAM has by far the lowest when you get out to those ranges past 60 meters. So if you're hitting these shots, especially while mounted, you will be doing, if your aim's good, you'll be absolutely beaming people from a good distance away. So let me turn these off and turn on the guns we're competing against. So the FAR and the AMAX. You can see that the FFAR is just crazy. It outdamages everything all the way up to 43.5 meters. And then it's only slightly worse than the AMAX when you're hitting your shots. And so you can see from some of my earlier gameplay that the AMAX is kind of hard to hit some shots sometimes. But when you do hit them, it hits hard. And the FAR fires really fast, but it has some recoil, and it's hard to just hit these shots. You're hitting your shots so much more consistently with the RAM at this range that even though it has a slower TTK, technically, you're hitting far more of the shots. You're actually doing more damage. Now, it's worth showing that this is for chest shots. If we go to stomach, these reset. Let me just turn the ones we don't need off real quick. You can see that the FFR is still really good, but the AMAX kind of slows down. And for the majority of the time, they're either really close, the RAM and the AMAX, or the RAM's just way better. And so if we look at extremities, basically the FAR, you can see, has no weakness. But once again, the RAM is really good. And if we go to headshots, the RAM is much closer to the FFR, better than the AMAX still, because of its higher fire rate. But remember, you're probably not hitting that many bullets compared to how many you're hitting with the RAM, and it's got that Kilo effect where it's really strong and beams people. And finally, bullet velocity. The RAM is in a really good spot for its bullet velocity. A lot of the other ARs around it are like the AMAX, 959 meters per second, Kilo, M13, M4 in the 1200s. But the RAM coming in at 1,341 meters per second, way more than the AMAX and 20% more than the FFAR. I mean, the FFAR, if you can hit your bullets, you'll fry. But it's just the likelihood of doing that at longer ranges. And the RAM's only slightly worse at the mid ranges. Possibly better if you're actually hitting your shots where the FFAR might not be with some of its heftier recoil. Or you could be changing your engagements and using your secondary that may be more advantageous. Either way, you can see that the RAM is the king of bullet velocity for the assault rifles. Finally, the RAM has a unique scope that not every weapon has. I mean, most ARs have a 4.0 optic, but none have a really clean reticle, in my opinion. The RAM does. The Elite 2x2 scope. It can even have the T-pose, as you just saw, which is arguably the cleanest reticle in the game, and a favorite for AMAX users. A lot of people like the axial scope from Cold War guns, and now you have a similar zoom level on a Modern Warfare rifle that looks really good as well. So there you have it. There's the argument to be using the RAM right now in the current meta. As always, remember that fourth rule. Whatever feels best, that's the gun you should use. Whatever you're having fun with, that's the gun you should use. But there's looking at some of the important statistics for Warzone. The case can be made that the RAM is a very good gun and worth your consideration in using in the Warzone. So that's pretty much all I have to say about that. I'll just leave this gameplay here for you to finish out. Unfortunately, we don't come away with the win, but I try my hardest to do it. It's funny, though, because I actually lose to an AMAX, but I would have lost any gun because I don't hit my shots.
You shoot me through the tree.
Gas is moving in. New safe zone located.
Oh, you gotta go straight to him.
Shine, man.
He's on the mountainside.
Gas is moving.
Guy right in front of you on the ground.
Now stand up and fight.
Oh wow.
Oh, you got top? Yeah, that's the guy that's cheating.
Let's come back and
Freaking error guy.
lost that.
He's using some kind of wall, because he's shooting me through a tree the whole time.